colleagues, friends, students, guests, good afternoon. Good afternoon to you all, and thank you for being here. My name is Douglas Henry. I'm Dean of the Honors College. On behalf of my faculty and staff colleagues in the wider university and the Drumwright family, please receive my warm welcome and even more heartfelt joy to be gathered here with you. We have a wonderful program in store. As some of you know, because I told many of you today, I place a high premium on presence to one another, on conversation that enriches our understanding and expands the range of our intellectual life, that helps us to ask and answer important questions intelligently, that fulfills an academic community life that's marked by the Christian faith and academic rigor to which we promise our students some access in our university mission. The Honors College is not the only site at Baylor in which these things are pursued, but it is an important such site. So here again, my gratitude for your presence and your stewardship of our shared life. This lecture series is named in honor of Minette Drumwright Pratt. Minette was and is dear to a great cloud of witnesses whose lives have been shaped by a Baylor education. I encourage you, as you have opportunity, to take a look at the wonderful bio that's included in your program. Minette was a part of the original Honors College Advisory Council. She was a champion of this effort to establish a place of exemplary undergraduate education at Baylor in continuity with a long record of such, but pulling together a number of resources in new ways, and her friendship and her advocacy have been important through the years for us. And beyond Baylor, I'd just say her Christian grace and prayerfulness and leadership and faith bless countless people the world around, and that matters too. Minette has two daughters, Mimi and Debbie, and they have been in the habit of attending this lecture. Minette is now quite frail and struggles with advanced dementia, but Mimi and Debbie, her two daughters, have been in the habit of joining us for this lecture series. Mimi has an active career and academic life at the University of Texas, and schedule didn't permit her to be here. Debbie is expecting her first grandchild, and I told our lecturer, our guest, that as committed as I believe she is to justice and pursuing it in toxic times, the call of her imminently arriving grandchild was a stronger pull, and perhaps there is some justice done to her family in being present for that grandmotherly justice, as it were. One last thing, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Tran, who will introduce our speaker. We're in this beautiful space, and I don't know if your eyes are good enough or the light is sharp enough for you to make out some of the things inscribed on the walls around, but I just note them as possibly connected to the theme of today's talk. There is the one here to my left, up in this corner. Then welcome each rebuff that turns earth's smoothness rough, each sting that bids nor sit nor stand, but go. Or one that is behind you in the back corner here. I say the knowledge of God in Christ, accepted by thy reason, solves for thee all questions in the earth and out of it. Or the one perhaps you can see best, it's in this corner just in front of you. Knowledge means ever renewed assurance by defeat that victory is somehow still to reach. I look forward with you to hearing from this afternoon's distinguished lecturer. To introduce him is our colleague, Dr. Jonathan Tran, Associate Dean for Faculty of the Honors College. Jonathan.
Thank you, Dean Henry. Lately, things have had the feel of the apocalyptic. I mean this both in that end times sense, with in so many places these days, wars and rumors of wars. Things in our world are usually desperate, and it is primarily a function of privilege that people like me don't more readily recognize its apocalyptic conditions. But I also mean apocalyptic in that revelatory sense, apocalypse as unveiling, of the world groaning and of God speaking, and with all the questions that come about whether or not we have eyes to see and ears to hear. It is in the midst of this feel for the apocalyptic that it is a great gift to have Professor Vincent Lloyd on campus to give the Drumwright Family Lecture. I can think of no one better to help us see and hear amidst wars and rumors of wars. Professor Lloyd is widely recognized as one of the most important theologians working in America today. With degrees from Princeton and Berkeley and faculty posts at Syracuse and Villanova, Vincent Lloyd is one of those people who feels seemingly everywhere all at once. And for good reasons. His books, to name just a few, Religion of the Field Negro, Black Natural Law, and most recently, Black Dignity, The Struggle Against Domination, with Fordham University Press, Oxford University Press, and Yale University Press. These books have collectively changed the conversation within political theology and theological and religious ethics. His public-facing essays and interviewings, including an article last spring that proved the rare crossover piece landing Dr. Lloyd on PBS, CNN, and The Atlantic, have themselves become the conversation. And no wonder his work is of the change the conversation and become the conversation variety, as you will see today. All of this is surprising to anyone who has ever spent time with Vincent, who is truly a gentle soul, not the kind that you would think would rock the boat, much less unleash the storm. The fact that he is both a gentle soul and a boat rocker / storm unleasher gives, I think, a picture of the intellectual life to which we might aspire and with whom we might want to conspire. Such aspirations and conspiracies are what we are about today. Join me in welcoming Vincent Lloyd to Baylor University.
What a beautiful space. This is just, I have to struggle to keep my concentration on the talk here. Thanks so much, Jonathan, for that generous, overly generous introduction and for being such a wonderful host during this visit to Waco. I've learned a great deal from reading Jonathan's work over the years and from conversations with him, and I'm excited about the collaborative projects we have in the works. Thanks as well to the Honors College staff and to Dean Henry Douglas, to colleagues and friends at Baylor, and to all of you here. And of course, my thanks are especially due to Minette Drumwright Pratt and her family for establishing this lecture series. I'd like to begin with a story that speaks to the complexities and frustrations of our current cultural moment. Last year, a friend of mine who teaches at Swarthmore College was talking with his students about that week's reading. It was a Black Studies class, and they were looking at one of the founding documents of Black feminism, Hortense Spiller's article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. It's an academic article, but one that has been enthusiastically embraced by activists, acquiring a status rather like the books of Malcolm X and Frantz Fanon for an earlier generation. Spillers is one of the founding theorists of intersectionality, laying out a framework for how race and gender ought to be thought together and how the experience of both in our contemporary world are tied back to the Middle Passage. Near the end of Spiller's article, she describes the other scholars who made her work possible. She singles out one in particular, Valerie Smith, who, Spillers writes, enables our notion that female gender for captive women's community is a tale written between the lines and in the not-quite spaces of an American domesticity. In other words, Valerie Smith is a cornerstone on which this classic of black feminism is built. According to my friend, a student piped up, "Is that our Valerie Smith?" The student knew that Valerie Smith was their president, the first black president of Swarthmore. The student also knew that, in her leadership role, Smith had been the target of energetic student protests on a range of issues, from sexual violence on campus to Israel-Palestine to climate change to racial justice. In the culture of student protest, in meetings and social media posts and group chats, Smith was marked as the enemy. In students' minds, it was up to her whether sexual violence on campus would end, whether white supremacy would be broken, whether climate catastrophe would come to pass. And Smith failed to act. Now my friend's student was discovering that Smith was also a pioneering scholar whose writings provided the intellectual foundations for the activist culture that has swept into many US colleges and universities. Often in that culture, there are heroes and there are enemies, and theorists like Spillers and Smith are unequivocally classed as heroes. But Smith, as college president, had been classed as an enemy. The easy division of the world this student had imagined was suddenly fraught. The first major round of protests that Smith faced 3 years into her presidency was aimed at addressing sexual violence on Swarthmore's campus. A 9-day sit-in ended when Smith agreed to meet with the protesters and open a dialogue. The next year, newspapers obtained and printed internal emails from a Swarthmore fraternity joking about rape and dripping and misogyny and homophobia. Student protesters occupied the fraternity house for 5 days until it agreed to dissolve. Then they moved to Smith's office. There they sat, demanding that she permanently ban Greek life and that the fraternity houses be transformed into resource centers and safe spaces for female and racial minority students. Students unfurled a giant banner querying, "President Smith, where are you?" The student occupiers, none of whom appeared to be black, declared that they were sitting in, quote, "so that you, President Valerie Smith, will remember us and the harm that was done to us." Campus security officers locked the bathroom to the occupied building and threatened the students with arrest. After a few hours, the occupation ended. The students were incensed, declaring, quote, "We find it in bad faith that President Smith would say that she respects and affirms the rights of students to demonstrate peacefully while forcing us to choose between exercising these rights and our basic human dignity." Another fact about Smith that many students did not know: exactly 30 years earlier, she resigned from her tenured job at Princeton in protest of the institution's mishandling of sexual harassment complaints. The protester's enemy had once been a protester herself. In this story, I think everyone is well-intentioned. The student activists feel the urgency of a call to justice. They realize that demonizing one's enemy is an effective tactic for dramatizing injustice and for mobilizing support. What matters to them is their moment where they live and not what happened 30 years before in New Jersey. Now, it might be tempting to dismiss the student activists as young and short-sighted, not sufficiently appreciative of the complexities of the world. I neither want to condone nor condemn the student activists, but I want to analyze what is going on when a situation where right and wrong, good and bad, seem to be scrambled, where those pursuing justice seem to be turning on each other rather than working together to bring about a more just world. We do need to fully appreciate the urgency that the student activists feel, the sort of urgency that has not been part of activist culture for a half-century. There is a sense that the bodies and lives of the activists themselves are under threat, that they face the imminent possibility of harm, that their actions grow out of a sort of visceral self-defense, a need to be safe from harm. Such a framing has been much maligned in certain strands of public discourse recently, but I think we need to take it seriously. We need to appreciate that when we see people organizing for justice, setting aside their comfortable routines, and putting themselves at risk in order to pursue justice, they probably are motivated by something quite real. Something that we all ought to be paying attention to, that we can all learn from, whether or not we think their particular tactics or rhetoric are right or wrong. As you at Baylor well know, campus sexual assault is a very real problem. People put forward different numbers, but at my university, Villanova, according to the last self-reporting I saw, 1/4 of female students attest to having been sexually assaulted by the time they graduate. Self-reported data obviously underestimates the numbers, probably dramatically underestimates them, and there's nothing exceptional about Villanova. Consider if a construction worker was offered a 4-year contract for a job that paid really well, but there was a 25% chance he would be seriously, permanently injured. No one would take the job. If a car salesman told you that this vehicle is especially cheap, but there's a 1 in 4 chance it will cause an accident that will seriously injure you, no one would buy the car. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I'm trying to understand the logic that would justify sending her to a place, any college, where there is a 1 in 4 chance she will experience sexual violence. This is all to say, we need to appreciate the urgency that is felt by campus activists around the issue of sexual assault, but also around many other issues. At the same time, we have to recognize that the pursuit of justice often results in confusion, in disorientation. When urgency and confusion join together, what results is toxicity. Those who ought to be allies turning on each other, suspecting each other, attacking each other, all in the name of justice. In the process, the meaning of justice is distorted until it becomes unrecognizable, with the energy of urgency turned into negative affect and, eventually, disillusion. My suggestion this afternoon is that we need to think through how the urgent pursuit of justice can fit together with a right orientation toward justice. We need both. And we see what happens when we focus only on urgency, not at all on that right orientation. This is natural. Developing a right orientation toward justice is slow, hard work. It is the work of formation, forming souls, forming communities. It pulls in precisely the opposite direction of the imperatives of urgency. And for us to respond rightly to the urgency we feel in a moment, we need to find ways to value and make space for the slow work of formation. We have to do two things at once, and we cannot let our focus drift toward one at the expense of the other, either one. If we drift toward urgency, the result is toxicity. If we drift toward that slow, hard work of formation, the result is forgetting how high the stakes are for us and for our children. Let me reflect for a few minutes on why there is urgency in the air. We may or may not feel it ourselves, but we certainly know those who do. While this sense of urgency has to do with the number of social and political issues facing us today and their significance, it is more than that. Today, the stakes of these issues feel not just more important than before, but existential. They feel like revelations overlooked by generations before, and they are amplified by a new media landscape that creates new ways of feeling community. The long 2010s was a decade of crisis. In the US, the first black president governed, but racism was not over. New technology circulated images of police officers harassing, injuring, and killing black Americans, and the Black Lives Matter movement was born. So were a host of other social movements. Me Too gave new life and focus to feminism. Standing Rock and I Don't Know More drew attention to the continuing violence of settler colonialism. Teenage climate change activists interrupted their education and public life to call attention to the impending end of the world. And socialism in the US went from eccentricity to a rapidly growing political movement. All of this social movement energy and innovation followed from the crisis which launched the decade, the 2008 financial crisis, the Great Recession. The sense of economic comfort and predictability that had flowed from generation to generation of the North Atlantic middle class since the end of the Second World War suddenly vanished. For young people previously insulated from financial pressures, the future grew dark. It no longer looked as though their standard of living would match, let alone exceed, that of their parents. A generation was primed to appreciate and in some cases join insurgent social movements. Social movements were gaining steam because of the failures of existing political institutions to manage economic, cultural, and ecological crises. Neither government bureaucracy nor elected officials seemed able to respond to the gravity of the problems that were now top of mind. From the right, proto-fascist movements were attracting increasing support and visibility and captured political office. This only raised the stakes for justice-oriented social movements. If they did not succeed, lives were at risk and nations were at risk of succumbing to full-blown fascism. If the pressure was not high enough, the decade was capped by the 2020 pandemic, which exacerbated existing inequalities, licensed even more illiberal instincts on the right and left, and pushed the high-stakes framing of politics, a matter of life or death, into mainstream discourse everywhere, for everyone. And let's not forget, forest fires, superstorms, hurricanes, droughts, and floods and tornadoes were a reminder that climate change was making the earth unlivable. Not just my existence, but human existence was at stake. Yet political actors seem to be going about business as usual. The discourses of crises and their accompanying social movements were new to mainstream public discourse. But these crises were no surprise to communities who had been marginalized and had long been speaking about anti-Black racism, sexual assault, environmental degradation, and poverty. For communities at the margins, those crises were not intellectual problems. They were felt bodily, daily. And they were doubled. Crises because of the harm they caused, and crises because they were being ignored. The harms could not be spoken. So some of the urgency of the long 2010s was not only about the existential stakes of the issues we face, but also about their status as revelations. How could we have ignored them? How could our parents have ignored them? The feeling, thus, is not just that we have to act now before it's too late, but that we are already acting too late, that everyone before us and many around us ignore issues that need immediate response, that we are the ones chosen to receive a special revelation about injustice, a special mission to pursue justice. Finally, the sense of urgency felt today in the long 2010s comes from the new forms of communication and community that we now inhabit. No longer are questions of justice national or international issues that we hear about once a day on the evening news, distanced from our lived experience of community, from our life together with our neighbors, from figuring out why that person's recycling bin ended up down the block and how we can keep the raccoons out of the trash. Now, via technology, we're part of communities that are woven into our day as we consume and share news, and distanced from us, people we never have to see and smell and touch and navigate the practical problems of daily life with. So with a feeling of life or death stakes, with a feeling that we have unique access to the problems of the day, we confront this sense of urgency, not with those around us, with whom we share the grit and softness of life, but with friends in name only, mediated and abstract, yet amplifying our concerns. Perhaps amplifying them because of that abstraction. The more existential concern remains abstract rather than tethered to the concrete, the more frightening and debilitating it becomes. Let's zoom out. When we see a cultural moment where the rhetoric is so strong, a moment that is committed to its own uniqueness, its own import, how are we to understand what's happening? I think the language of paradigm shift is helpful here, a language embraced in a rather technical sense in the philosophy of science, but then popularized to the point of cliché. One paradigm is ending. We can see that it no longer fits the world. It no longer matches the evidence. We need to set it aside, but it is not yet clear what the new paradigm will be. Everything seems unsettled. Just yesterday or a couple of decades ago, it seemed as if everything was operating normally, predictably. Now, everything seems up in the air. Philosophers of science point to, for example, the switch between Newtonian physics and the theory of relativity as another such moment within the domain of science. Now, in the domain of culture, it feels like culture is is everything, though of course it isn't, and the shift we're feeling is not across culture, but in certain areas of culture. An old paradigm is unsettled, and the only way we can reach a new paradigm is by trial and error, by experimentation, by seeing what new ways of organizing ourselves fit and which do not. It makes sense that such a moment produces vertigo, often articulated these days as anxiety. And yet it is essential. We're leaving behind old paradigms for good reason. There was racism that went unnoticed. There was sexual assault that was treated as acceptable. There was environmental complacency that led to mass extinction. There are millions, billions who suffer the indignities of poverty, struggling to meet their basic needs every day. The long 2010s taught us to notice and name these consequences of an old paradigm, and now we have to collectively imagine what could come next. And it could go horribly wrong. It has before. Consider the similar paradigm shift we experienced in the long 1960s. A combination of technological change and activism made visible injustices that had been concealed from public discourse. We started talking about segregation as a moral problem rather than a local custom. We realized that domestic violence was rampant. We were mortified by the atrocities in Vietnam committed in the name of democracy. The stakes felt high, even existential. There was an element of revelation. What had been concealed or relegated to the margins was now made visible. And there were shifts in how we understood moral community, made possible by live television reporting, among other things. All of this resulted from problems with an old paradigm rendered in shorthand the system and activist culture of the time. That old paradigm had to fall away. It was not clear what would come next, but action needed to be taken urgently. But in responding to that sense of compounding crises in the long 60s, there was a sense of urgency without a commitment to do the slow, difficult work of orienting ourselves individually and collectively toward justice. The results ultimately were grim. Yes, some laws were changed, but violent racism continued in new ways, violence against women continued in new ways, and the nation was complicit in human rights violations in different corners of the world. Worse than that, the long 60s were marked by toxicity and violence. With state repression of justice movements, those movements fragmented and radicalized. We remember the Summer of Love, but we tend to forget the rise of sectarian groups putting forward dogma, sometimes about politics, sometimes about religion in the early 70s. The 70s also saw the rise of the phenomenon of the cult, the utopian promise of the moment when paradigm shift was downsized to the promise of cult leader and scaled up to cosmic proportions, with salvation offered to the select few. In political terms, this sense of urgency and insularity resulted in a moment of violence that's often forgotten in U.S. history. In the early 70s, there were more than 1,000 instances of domestic terrorism per year. In some periods, more than 5 bombs going off each day around police stations, government offices, and the homes of officials. While many lament the polarization and tumult of the last few years and the toxicity of our age, it's all quite pacific compared to what was happening a half-century ago. And this reminds us, once again, of the stakes of these unsettled times. When we know we must turn away from our old paradigm, how can we move toward a new one, move toward a world of justice without slipping into chaos and self-destruction? Before I turn to addressing this question, let us sort through some of the activist rhetoric that swirls around us today, language that often seems hyperbolic. It can seem as if the demand is to throw away all forms of authority, to wallow in a world without rule, a demand which is easy to dismiss as mythical and a dangerous myth at that. The language of harm is becoming ubiquitous, and it is also ambiguous. If the goal is a world without harm, and all authorities are harmful, whether they intend to be or not, whether they know it or not, then anarchy must be the endpoint. Harm or anarchy, that seems to be the choice. Moreover, in activist rhetoric, harm is often presented as the occasion for urgency, but also as a symptom of something much deeper. There are systems at work, lurking underground, persisting through history, the roots of the harms that are experienced by racial minorities, by women, by immigrants, and by poor people today. So the solution seems not only to be overturning authority, but uprooting authority, digging up and overturning the systems that author harm, overturning systemic racism, patriarchy, capitalism, and nationalism. In short, total revolution would seem to be the necessary prerequisite to anarchy. It is tempting to dismiss such views too quickly, I think. Just like those Swarthmore protesters, activists speaking about systemic injustice are not making things up. There are real deep problems with life and death stakes that require us to address them today, not tomorrow. But one of the challenges of the urgency that propels a movement forward is that it does not allow for time to sort through concepts. Movement language is rhetoric used to persuade. It also contains invaluable insights about justice. After all, those who have experienced injustice acquire special expertise on justice, even as that knowledge is defeasible. So we are tasked with listening to justice movements and discerning their insights. I come to this work of listening from the study of religion and theology. Like any intellectual formation, that background makes me notice some things and ignore other things. One of the things I notice is that the language of authority and the language of domination are used almost interchangeably in activist movements. Yet authority and domination are different things, and that difference is hugely important. Authority is deference we give to others for good reason. I treat the dentist as an authority because she has more knowledge about teeth than I do. I allow her reasons to trump my own with respect to teeth. Authority is necessarily limited in scope. We defer to authorities for particular domains of our life. And we defer not to them as a person, but to them in their particular role. It does not matter how charismatic the dentist is, or how talented she is at painting, or how loving a parent she is. It matters that she knows about teeth. In short, dealing with authority is part of navigating ordinary life. We turn to authorities pragmatically to advance our interests, so we do not need to spend time acquiring expertise on everything. What activists really mean when they are attacking authority is domination, I think. Domination means arbitrary rule. It means having the capacity to impose my will on you at my whim. It is not well-bounded like authority, and it does not serve the interests of the one dominated. In theological terms, domination involves an individual setting themselves up as a god, lording themselves over others. It is a form of idolatry. It's always wrong. Domination turns us away from the true, the good, and the beautiful, pulling us down to the world, to worldly interest, to individual self-interest. As Augustine famously argues, the will to dominate is part of the human condition, and so the project of ethical life and spiritual life is pursuing the impossible task of suppressing this will to dominate in order to allow oneself to be rightly oriented to goodness, truth, and beauty by the grace of God. While I don't think Augustine has much to say about dentists, by thinking about dentists, we can see how it is tempting to slip between authority and domination in discourse and practice. I visited the dentist on Friday, so I have particularly strong feelings on this at the moment. Dentists tend to enjoy their authority a bit too much. They tend to forget that it's domain-specific, that they receive deference pragmatically rather than absolutely. In short, authority tends toward domination. That is why it's so important to create institutional contexts where authority can be kept in check, to have professional associations and unions and regulatory agencies and consumer groups that make sure dentists do not dominate. With respect to my particular dentist, I think the combination of technocratic culture and insurance companies have the opposite effect here, exacerbating the will to dominate, but that's another talk. I say all of this so that we can reconstruct a story about harm, its depth, and its intractability that refines activist intuitions. Specifically, what activists in the long 2010s are putting their finger on is exactly what Augustine put his finger on when he wrote not only Confessions, but also City of God. The former was about the will to dominate at the level of the individual, the latter about the will to dominate at the level of society. Together, they remind us that harms do flow from both individuals and systems, and that the two levels are intertwined. They also remind us that the world is terribly complex, and that it's imperative to try and fail and try again to tell stories about that name domination in order that it might be uprooted. I take Frederick Douglass to be one of our most talented experts at such storytelling. His context is particularly illuminating because domination as a concept has always been linked to slavery. Slavery provides the paradigm of domination, master arbitrarily exercising his will over another. Master constructing himself as a god. In the middle passage is slavery at its most refined, severing ties to family, language, land, and religion, leaving only enslaved individual face to face with master. The middle passage is domination in laboratory conditions, as it were, the site at which we can best study domination, the site at which we can best learn to respond to domination. Consider the story that is the centerpiece of each of Douglass's 3 autobiographies, the heart of his narrative, his fight with the slave breaker Edward Covey. As a boy of 16, Douglass finds himself lent to a poor white farmer, Covey, who has a reputation for crushing the will of slaves, making them pliable upon return to their owners. Covey whips Douglass repeatedly and mercilessly until Douglass runs off to his old master to appeal for help, only to be sent back to Covey. Upon his return, Covey first seems to ignore the boy's transgression. Then, as Douglass is going about his regular morning routine, feeding the horses, Covey sneaks up on him and tries to tie his legs with rope. Douglass leaps away. He's always been told to obey his master, to endure the brutality. There is no alternative. But for reasons he does not understand, Douglass resolves to fight. Quote, "I found my strong fingers firmly attached to the throat of the tyrant," Douglass writes, "as if we stood as equals before the law." It is as if Douglass sees a different reality, a future where there is equality instead of domination, and animated by that vision, he's able to fight. Covey, surprised by the boy's resistance, soon realizes that, man on man, he cannot defeat or capture Douglass. The master alone cannot control the slave. Used to always having his way, Covey is taken aback, scared and mute. The master lives under the illusion that he is really in control, that his power to command is a natural part of who he is. When that lie is exposed, he's shaken to the bone. After 2 hours of trying on his own to capture Douglass, Covey relents. He tells Douglass to continue with the farm chores, and Douglass does, but he is now a new man. Covey will not whip him again, but there is a more significant change. The fight, quote, "rekindled in my breast the smoldering embers of liberty." Douglass was not free, but in his bodily struggle with Covey, he had a foretaste of freedom. He began dreaming more often about life without a master. At the same time, Douglass's self-image transformed. Quote, "I was nothing before. I was a man now." Unquote. He had believed what his master and his world said about him, that he was less than human, just another beast of burden on the farm. Struggle inspired him to struggle again in new ways for freedom. Douglass concludes, quote, "A man without force is without the essential dignity of humanity, dignity in struggle." Domination extends from a specific interpersonal relationship, master and slave, to a system, obfuscating its origins and mechanisms. In the starkest form of slavery, persuading a person that another person can be treated as a slave requires an enormous apparatus of ideas, habits, feelings, institutions, and laws that conspire to make one class of people appear less than human. The Atlantic slave trade added a physical difference to the conspiracy, resulting in the package known as racialization. Even when one element is suspended, such as the legal regime of slavery, the apparatus persists. And it is the whole apparatus that creates the relationship of domination. The violence that symbolizes that relationship persists, but in new forms. Lynching replaces flogging, prison replaces lynching, the policeman's gun replaces the nightstick, which replaces the convict lease system. The symbols are impermanent, but the psychic and social work they perform is consistent, reinforcing systems of domination that constitute the afterlives of slavery that persist into the present. When domination is understood as an expansive apparatus that includes ideas, habits, feelings, institutions, and laws, struggle against it can take place in any of these dimensions. Domination persists when enough of the elements of the apparatus work together, sustaining ideas or feelings or laws that authorize, for example, anti-black racism, against which black people struggle through music or protest or tactical silence. The proper object of study in the deepest, the proper object of struggle in the deepest sense is domination, recognizable because it necessarily involves the arbitrary exercise of one's will over another. In the primal scene of domination, the master's will is the overriding reality. In the world at large, often there is no one person standing as master, so there may seem to be no will involved. Focusing on the arbitrary exercise of individual will can even mislead. It can draw our attention to the bad apple, the police officer who's disproportionately harassing black motorists, or the boss who dismisses applicants with black-sounding names, rather than the system of domination of which those individuals play a part. It is necessary to toggle between the primal scene of domination, such as the one described by Douglas, and the complexities of the real world. If we can tell the right kind of story, linking the primal scene with a set of practices in the real world, we will have identified the one whose will looms over the life of another. In that primal scene, it is obviously Covey's will that can be arbitrarily imposed on Douglas. It then becomes an empirical task to fill in the details of purported domination in any given context, demonstrate how they are linked into a system, and show how that system is structurally homologous to the primal scene of domination. In this way, domination points to an ontological condition rooted in its primal scene, whereas concepts like oppression, suffering, exploitation, injustice, and marginalization point to ontic conditions, specific harms in the world. What I've been doing is redescribing activist language in a way that brings clarity and focus to it, attempting to make plausible claims that, on their surface, may sound absurd. We can all agree that domination ought to be stopped, urgently. What the activist is trying to do is tell a story that helps us see certain practices in our complex contemporary world as part of a matrix of domination. By moving back and forth between Douglas's primal scene of domination and the complexities of the present world, and by weaving together in narrative and so bringing to salience a set of practices in our world, responding to domination here and now becomes urgent, even if domination involves seemingly small, seemingly isolated instances of benign personal vice or ignorance. The police officer's tone of voice, the colleague's offhanded comment about a woman's appearance, or the compost that absentmindedly ends up in the trash bin. These all can be woven into stories of domination and so warrant response. Of course, that's where things get tricky. Vigorously responding to all of the instances of domination that we find around us, under the account provided by a particularly compelling story, like that of anti-blackness, can be exhausting. And the language of exhaustion is now widespread in activist discourse. Even more worryingly, when urgent response seems warranted, we become all the more invested in the truth of the particular stories we tell about domination. We forget that about their status as stories, as tools for noticing important aspects of the world that would otherwise be overlooked. The more invested we are in one particular story of domination, the more we forget that there might be better stories, more effective at naming domination. We are back to where we started, the need to balance urgency and right orientation toward justice, when they seem to pull in opposite directions. I'm afraid I'm not going to offer an answer to how to solve this problem, only avenues of response. If urgency and right orientation mark two halves of justice struggles, they are halves that do not fit together and cannot fit together. But appreciating this is itself an imperative of justice. It is part of appreciating the fallenness of the world, of attending to the tragic. By this I do not mean the number of bad things that exist in the world. Tragedy is far deeper than that. It refers to the limitations of our humanity, the frequency with which we are forced to choose between competing goods. It refers to the losses that we inevitably face and mourn, and as we make choices, make mistakes, fulfill our obligations to some at the expense of others, and lose what is dear to us, including aspects of ourselves. We imagine that we can insulate ourselves from the tragic, cloaking ourselves with security, with fences and walls, with blindness, with forgetting. But the world does not work that way. The world is fallen, and the more we pretend that is not the case, the more vulnerable we become. Consider peanut butter. As we all know, there's been a significant rise in recent decades in the US in peanut allergies. This puzzled researchers for a long time. Was it environmental factors, additives, lifestyle? Then they noticed that in Israel, peanut allergy levels have been and continue to be very, very low. And they noticed, too, that in Israel, the most popular snack is bamba, horrible tasting stuff. Bamba, a puffed corn made with peanuts. Israelis love bamba. They eat it all the time, and they give it to everyone, even little babies. It's often one of the first foods babies taste, and yet the population of Israel has a very low occurrence of peanut allergy. Then scientists formulated and tested a hypothesis. Maybe exposing small children to peanuts decreases the likelihood that they will develop peanut allergies. It turns out that's exactly right. And the most likely account of the rise of peanut allergies in the US is this. Parents started to worry more and more about peanut allergies, so prevented their young children from tasting peanuts, resulting in a rapid rise of peanut allergies. If we want to cultivate individuals and communities that are oriented toward justice, we need to remember peanut allergies. We must respond to harm, but we must not fetishize safety. We need to acknowledge that we all harm and are harmed, we all dominate and are dominated, that this is part of being human, even as we collectively struggle against domination. The more we delude ourselves into thinking we can, on our own, create safety, that we can, by our own effort, enter the land of milk and honey, the more domination there will be, and that domination will be insidious. We need to cultivate the skills to navigate the complexities of a world where domination runs rampant, while at the same time urgently challenging domination. We must do two things at once. Cultivating a sense of the tragic is one avenue of response to the call of justice in toxic times, but let me briefly offer two more. In times of urgency, when collective struggle against domination sweeps us up, it is easy to forget that people were struggling before there were words for anti-Black racism, patriarchy, capitalism. They were struggling against domination for generations, since the beginning of humankind. In fact, in Augustine's commentaries on Genesis, he locates the origins of the struggle against domination in the Garden of Eden. Tradition is not history. It is value-laden. Traditions of struggle are value-laden. The practices of a people over time have principles and norms implicit in them, and those principles and norms have binding force. They oblige us, even as we wrestle with them and interpret them anew. Just as we need to tell stories about domination that convey the urgency of action, we also need to tell stories about traditions of struggle that norm and bind our actions. In one sense, religious communities are one of the few sites in contemporary culture where this sense of tradition and obligation are made explicit. Yet religious communities tend to forget that the tragic is not just something that happens out there in the world. It characterizes religious communities themselves. To give one's primary allegiance to God instead of to the church means to commit oneself to rooting out false gods wherever they appear, which is to say, taking commitment to the struggle against domination as primary, and the tradition of struggle as binding. That takes faith. And for the activist filled with a sense of urgency, it's frustrating. It means we have to listen to elders, to grapple with authoritative texts, with great books, with the wisdom of the ancients, for the struggle against domination is evident in all of these. It also means we have to constantly re-narrate tradition so that it centers struggle rather than complacency. It takes as authoritative the voices of the marginalized, calling for liberation, rather than the voices of the powerful as they seek to manage conflict. Now we turn to my third and final offering as we think through how to orient ourselves toward justice. It may sound rather abstract or overly subtle, but I think it's crucially important. Let's call it an appreciation for differentiation. In moments of urgency, it seems as if everything significant is happening here and now. Everything needs to be approached from the perspective of here and now, ending this instance of domination in front of us, ending this moral abomination. Social media and other features of our postmodern culture are no help on this front, collapsing space and time into an urgent now, a ping demanding attention. To be rightly oriented to justice, however, we need to differentiate space and time. There are times for organizing and there are times for reflecting. There are times for politics and there are times for ethics. There are times for grief and mourning and there are times for action. There are times we need to line up, march, and chant in unison, and there are times we need to sit alone, contemplate, and maybe pray. These spaces and times need not be understood in simplistic terms, as days off, or as one stage in a life before another stage. We must allow a sense of urgency to punctuate our spaces of solitude and reflection, and we must allow the pull of justice to reflect on ourselves and our communities to interrupt sites of urgent action. We must allow the pull to reflect on ourselves and our communities to interrupt sites of urgent action. This brings us to a question of particular relevance here at a university. If the call of justice is so urgent today, if the stakes are so high, what business do we have doing what we do, reading and writing and thinking, valuing clarity and rigor, and embracing the Irenic spirit of intellectual life? I think the university plays a privileged role bringing together and coordinating our sense of urgency and our need for orientation. Here at universities, we are particularly good at filling out, wrestling with, and retelling stories of tradition. The urgency of justice movements creates blinders, focusing attention on the imminent and present, when domination manifests in similar ways across time and space. There is much struggles against domination can learn from historical and global comparison. Urgency is no friend of clarity and coherence. Universities are spaces where we can refine concepts, grapple with tension, and perform imminent critique. For all of this to happen, the autonomy of the university needs to be recognized. The university is not a justice movement. It should not be a justice movement. Blurring those boundaries is detrimental to the pursuit of justice. And yet, as an institution pursuing truth, goodness, and beauty, the university is an institution that must be committed to the struggle against domination. For domination is, at its core, an attack on the transcendental trio. Remember, struggle does not mean protest. It can take the form of intellectual work, or aesthetic performance, or silence, or prayer. As we are doing the mundane work of curriculum design, mentoring, and strategic planning, it strikes me as imperative that we remember that the struggle against domination is essential to the university's mission. And the starting point, though certainly not the ending point, of the struggle against domination was told to us by Frederick Douglass, physically grappling with his master. I've tried to model on a very small scale what I think the university can contribute to struggles for justice. We can distinguish authority from domination. We can clarify the logic animating claims growing out of justice movements. We can fill in cultural and historical context around those movements. I want to end by reminding us that we in the academy should not be tempted to overvalue the insights we can provide. Justice movements are not just political projects, they're also intellectual projects. And much of my diagnosis can be found in the words of activists themselves when we listen to what they say beyond the caricatures that are so often presented to us in the media. Consider how the activists Morgan Vasichis, Alexander Lee, and Dean Spade capture the mood of the moment when, in 2011, they wrote, quote, "Impossibility may very well be our only possibility. What would it mean to embrace, rather than shy away from, the impossibility of our ways of living as well as our political visions? What would it mean to desire a future that we can't even imagine, but that we are told could not ever exist?" Unquote. Here we have a sense of impossibility, a sense of stuckness. The horizon of possibility does not include anything remotely resembling justice or on any of the many fronts where marginalized communities are mobilizing. The proper response, these activists hint, has an existential dimension. We must lean into impossibility. We must acknowledge that the world as it is, our social practices and norms, need to come to an end. We also must acknowledge that the just world we hope for is blocked from coming into existence. We are stuck between an impossible present and an impossible future. And impossibility here is not merely theoretical. It means the negation of the conditions of life. Put simply, it means death. And yet we desire life. We desire a future of flourishing, even as there is no plausible path from here to there. In their reflections, Vasichis, Lee, and Spade invoke hope, faith, desire, and the unknown. And consider Mariam Kaba, a Muslim activist who has become the most prominent voice of the prison reform movement. She reminds her comrades who worry about misspeaking or getting things wrong in their activist practice, quote, "We are actually not fragile beings." In other words, we live in a fallen world where we all have, do, and will harm, and we are harmed, yet we still persist in questing for justice. Kaba continues, quote, "When we set about trying to transform society, we must remember that we ourselves will also need to transform. Our imagination of what a different world can be is limited. We are deeply entangled in the very systems we are organizing to change," unquote. While it may be the case in theory that a vision of a world without domination, a world of freedom, animates and guides struggles in the present, in fact, our imaginations are imperfect. They're shaped by systems of domination. Therefore, our political actions in the present are imperfect, and they're guided by an imperfect vision. There is no path to purity, no way to extract ourselves from the fallen world in which we are formed. The only thing to do is to extend our critical analysis, our suspicion of domination, from the world to ourselves, to continually work toward transforming ourselves away from the habits we have acquired from the racist, patriarchal, colonial world in which we were formed, regardless of our identity, knowing we will fail. This persistence requires faith. Whether such faith can exist without explicit belief in God, without the presence of a religious community, is a question well above my pay grade. But from my vantage point, religious traditions are uniquely well suited to teach us what it means to commit to justice in toxic times, and so are universities that remain steadfastly guided by religious values. Thank you.
Well, Professor Lloyd has given us plenty to think about and plenty to talk about. We have about 10 minutes for question and answers, and Professor Lloyd has been kind enough to give us that time. I did want to remind you, as you think about who wants to ask the first question, shortly after our time here, we can go downstairs for a reception that's sponsored by the Honors College and the Endowed Lecture. So please, we welcome you to that. So who would like to ask the first question?
Advertisers are constantly
Thanks, yeah. Just to repeat, the question is, how much does a sense of urgency come from consumer culture? And certainly there's a dimension of that, and it might be interesting to think about this earlier moment a half century ago as well, where there was a lot of anxiety around consumer culture in the 50s and 60s, at the same time that this different sense of urgency was fueling justice movements and other movements. So certainly there's a sort of technological component of technological change. And I mean, my intuition, and I haven't fully thought through this, my intuition is that it's more about technological change than the particularities of technology. But we get used to technology, right? We get used to live television news. But when live television news was new and was covering protests in the South, right, it was startling, right? It threw people off, right? It illuminated moral questions that had been in the dark for so long. And similarly, I think for some of the racial justice protests in the last decade, right? To be able to take videos with your cell phone, right? There's something startling about the newness of that technology, which we'll get used to, right? We'll get used to the technology. The videos will circulate everywhere. So I think as technology changes, that's certainly something that we should be aware of, the sort of urgency that those shifts in technology create, I think.
Thank you so much for your talk and also for your body of work, which is really inspiring. And so I kind of had a similar question, but I was thinking, okay, is one of the lessons of your talk that we should apply this kind of distinction practice to urgency too? So on the one hand, urgency seems sort of like a product of white Weberian Protestant. And so for activists to be taking it on seems like to be missing the point in a way. And you might think that a lot of successful political movements have been successful because they have the right conception of urgency. So like King, you were talking about, thinking about his pronouncements that we can't wait, but also exhibiting a kind of waiting and being very strategic about when, where, and how they're going to implement. So is it true that it's impossible to hold together urgency and this sort of slow movement when we think about urgency in the terms that maybe some other traditions have?
Oh, that's wonderful. That's a wonderful question and beautiful examples, and one that I'll be sitting with and thinking about for a long time. Right, so, just to sort of speak back to you the question as I'm thinking about it, right? Urgency is itself constructed, right? It comes from a particular tradition, the sort of articulations of urgency and even feeling of urgency doesn't sort of exist just as an abstract phenomenon. It exists in particular cultural contexts and it manifests in different ways in different cultural contexts. So, I mean, on the one hand, it seems very true that particularly the rhetoric of urgency is quite contextually specific. I mean, maybe I'm too much of a humanist at the end of the day on this, but I do have the intuition that there's a sort of phenomenology of urgency that is pretty deep in the human condition, right? When there's an existential threat, right? We have uncontrollable emotions to respond to that threat. How those emotions get sort of manifest, right? In action, in language, varies certainly and is sort of culturally scripted. But that sense of like your money or your life, right? I need to respond to there's this risk that I need to my existence that requires response. It does feel to me at least quite universal. But thinking about how that is articulated differently and trying to disentangle the rhetoric of urgency from that core phenomenology of urgency seems like a really, really important task, one I want to keep thinking about.
Thank you for your very generous talk. Especially the third talk, well, it was almost an afterthought about religious institutions in particular, I think, it's sometimes I've wondered, it seems to me that the problem of urgency might be related in part to the waning of especially perhaps the concept of massive life, then every injustice becomes infinitely unacceptable. There is no excuse for letting someone suffer because they're never going to be redeemed. And so, first of all, I wonder if you think the rise of secularism might play a role in the way activists understand urgency. And might this also pose a bit of a problem, I would say, for the role of religious institutions to regain some kind of ground there with counsel people who have rejected that?
Thanks. Another great question, and one that's not unrelated to the previous question around the sort of scripting of urgency and whether urgency can be sort of embedded in these grammars that are cultural or religious, or and whether that makes the core phenomenon more manageable if it's scripted in particular ways. At least that's one way of sort of reading the question. And so there's a worry about secularism and a worry about individualism. I take these two to be somewhat different. And I mean, at least in my thinking on this sort of 60s moment, a half century ago, it seems like there is this sort of so there. Individualism is a kind of tricky thing, right? There's anxieties about individualism, there's a rhetoric of individualism, and then there's changes in society, right? Where people are talking to fewer people, they're not as networked in communities, right? And certainly, I mean, one could tell a story about the 60s where, a part of the urgency of that moment was the sense that individuals are being atomized, or they're less sort of less networked in their local communities, and so the television news, which is now entering their home live, right, calls forth a kind of response that's only possible because of that sort of separation from community, which is in that case ambivalent, right? There's a power to solitude, and there's a power to community, right? And sort of, and there are all sorts of, in the abstract, and yet, right, the sort of solitude that we're thinking about here is one that's forced, right? One that's forced by these sort of social forces. So I mean, on secularism, so I am a critic of secularism. I'm suspicious of secularism. I think it's an ideology that's entangled with white supremacy and with all sorts of other, and patriarchy and other sorts of bad things. And I think that's often not part of the story of secularism, right? That it's part of these sort of racial and gender projects of racial and gender violence. I mean, I think so. As sort of part of that, worrying about secularism and criticizing secularism does seem like a kind of prerequisite to rightly attending to the kind of urgency I was speaking about. In terms of religious institutions, I'm a lowly professor. I don't know about some of these big values issues and mission issues. That, I think that's above my pay grade as well. So sorry.
I know that you talked about how there are alternative ways to pursue justice to protesting, and additional ways. What are ways that we as students can sort of work to bring justice in our communities?
Thanks. Yeah. So the question said, beyond protesting, what are some ways that students can work to bring justice in their communities? Maybe I can say a couple of things about that. Thank you for the wonderful question. One is to think about who counts as part of your community, right? Is the community other students? Is it students and professors, professors, alumni, parents? Is it people who work at the university as well? Is it people who clean the university? Is it cafeteria workers at the university? Is it people who live in downtown Waco? Are they part of the community? Is it, who counts, with whom are we entangled in our relationships that make up a community? And with whom should we be envisioning, right, justice for our community. So that's one sort of prerequisite question. I mean, I think there's a kind of line in political space that sort of activism is easy, organizing is hard, right? That to go out to a protest about a particular event and hold a sign is easy, right? It takes a discrete amount of time, discrete, predictable labor, predictable effort. Organizing, which means building relationships, right? Which means doing analysis together, learning about things you don't know but affect you together, some introspection about what are we collectively in this community being, what injustices are we facing, what are the things that we need and we're not getting, who has the power to keep them, keep those things from us or to give them to us, how can we persuade those people in power, right? The 95% of that organizing work is about relationship building, study, intellectual work, analyzing, strategizing. Right? It's only the tip of the iceberg, right? That's the visible protest. And so, I mean, I think the sort of reflection on, where are, when we think of community in this broad sense, where are the people who are struggling to live, right? To raise families, to have enough to eat, to have freedom in some sense, and who are the people who hold power to affect that, and how can we persuade those people to change things? That's one sort of starting point in a fairly abstract sense. But thank you.
Just a reminder again that we will have a reception down below for about 30 minutes. For the Honors College students in the room, there's a barcode on either of the exits. So thank you for joining us today, and please join me in thanking Professor Lloyd one more time.